and welcome. I'd like to read the Stockholm Syndrome definition from Britannica. I'll leave the link to the website in the description below. The definition of Stockholm Syndrome is that it is a psychological response wherein a captive begins to identify closely with his or her captors, as well as with their agenda and demands. So that's the summary definition of what Stockholm Syndrome is. And the page continues. The name of the syndrome is derived from a botched bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden. In August 1973, 4 employees of Sveriges, don't know how to say it, credit bank were held hostage in the bank's vault for 6 days. During the standoff, a seemingly incongruous bond developed between captive and captor. One hostage, during a telephone call with Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme, don't know how to say it, stated that she fully trusted her captors, but feared that she would die in police assault on the building. So just reiterating that, the captive, the victim here, said that she fully trusted her captors. But she did not trust the police. She thought she would die in a police assault on the building. She felt safer with her captors. The page continues. Psychologists have studied the syndrome. Psychologists who have studied the syndrome believe that the bond is initially created when a captor threatens a captive's life, deliberates, and then chooses not to kill the captive. The captive's relief at the removal of the death threat is transposed into feelings of gratitude toward the captor for giving him or her life. So to reiterate what they're saying here is that psychologists who have studied the syndrome believe that it's created when the culprit, the captor, threatens the victim, threatens their life, or makes them feel unsafe, makes them feel like it's a life and death situation. And when the captor chooses not to kill the victim feels relief, and they transpose their feelings, like their fear is transposed. Their fear evolves into feelings of gratitude toward the captor. And it's a psychological response. People are not conscious necessarily. They're not consciously choosing to trust their captor. It's a psychological response to a life and death situation. You know, some people might think these people are stupid. You know, these victims are stupid for trusting their captors. Again, it's a psychological response in that it's not necessarily being made consciously. Stockholm Syndrome is not a conscious choice that the victim is choosing to make. It's a condition of the mind under a stressful situation, like feeling like your life is being threatened, feeling like you're close to death. And that's scary to think about, having no control over your mind, and your mind just like flips a switch. Your mind does everything in its power to protect you, and making you a docile victim who answers to commands and behaves obediently. That's what happens while under Stockholm Syndrome, while experiencing the psychological response to a threatening situation. I mean, it makes total sense to me, but I can see how some people may not understand. And I guess you would either have to be able to put yourself in their shoes, and it just naturally makes sense to you why they would respond like that, or you would have to be in that situation. And I don't think anyone really wants to be in that situation. But there are some situations, some psychological responses we may not understand unless it actually happens to us and we experience it directly. Okay, the page continues. As the Stockholm bank robbery incident proves, it takes only a few days for this bond to cement, proving that early on the victim's desire to survive trumps the urge to hate the person who created the situation. So that makes total sense to me. That when in a situation like that, the victim's mechanical response, their desire to survive, is stronger than their opinion of their captor, than maybe any transgressions they would have against their captor. It's a defense mechanism. It's a survival mechanism in and of itself. Stockholm Syndrome, it's when the brain flips a switch, and instead of being in constant fear, the brain says, you can survive this, you just have to be good, and you just have to trust your captor. And again, that's scary, but it does happen, and it's happened over and over again. The page continues. The survival instinct is at the heart of the Stockholm Syndrome. Victims live in enforced dependence and interpret rare or small acts of kindness in the midst of horrible conditions as good treatment. So to reiterate that, the victim is living in forced dependence. They are being forced to depend on their captor. And when the culprit is kind, even in the smallest way, the victim interprets those acts of kindness as relief, as like good treatment, like it becomes a reward system for the victim. When the captor is holding someone under duress, and there's no one else able to help the victim, then the captor becomes the victim's sole source of relief. So you can imagine the victim being relieved whenever the captor is nice to them. It's so sad to think about, too, that overall it's a dangerous situation either way you look at it, but the victim is feeling some relief when the captor is showing kindness to them. The page continues. They often become hypervigilant to the needs and demands of their captors, making psychological links between the captor's happiness and their own. Again, that's really sad. That in that situation, the victim is going to do everything that the captor says, because if the captor is happy, then the victim's happy. If the captor is content, then the captive is permitted to be content. I mean, that's slavery. That's a circumstance of slavery. It's a situation in which someone has become a slave. That's another way of looking at it. They don't actually have a choice in what's going on. So they're willing to do anything to survive that situation. Again, that's slavery. They are a slave. They are living on survival. They're just living to survive the next day, and they're willing to do anything. It's really sad. Next sentence. Indeed, the syndrome is marked not only by a positive bond between captive and captor, but also by a negative attitude on behalf of the captive toward authorities who threaten the captor-captive relationship. So they're linking this to the initial Stockholm situation and the botched bank robbery, that the victim in that situation, she ended up trusting her captors more so than law enforcement. So it's part of the definition of Stockholm Syndrome. Okay, and it continues. The negative attitude is especially powerful when the hostage is of no use to the captors except as leverage against a third party, as has often been the case with political. And it continued with a political example, but I skipped through it. Okay. And I think I skipped to the bottom, and it reads, by the 21st century, psychologists had expanded their understanding of Stockholm Syndrome from hostages to other groups, including victims of domestic violence, cult members, prisoners of war, procured prostitutes, and abused children. The American Psychiatric Association does not include Stockholm Syndrome in its DSM. So again, just reiterating that by the 21st century, psychologists have expanded their understanding of Stockholm Syndrome to not just captives and captors, people in life and death situations like in bank robberies, but they've expanded their understanding that Stockholm Syndrome also includes victims of domestic violence, cult members, prisoners of war, procured prostitutes, and abused children. And if we think about Sandra Birchmore, she falls into two of those groups. Sandra Birchmore was a victim of domestic violence, and Sandra Birchmore was an abused child. So let's watch this video.
Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Matthew Farwell and Sandra Birchmore? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Matthew Gregory Farwell was born in October 1985 and lived in the town of Northeaston, Massachusetts. He dropped out of high school during his junior year after having attendance issues. Matthew had participated in the Staunton Police Officers Academy. This is a quasi-military educational program for young people interested in a law enforcement career. Allegedly, he was caught impersonating a police officer and pulling over motor vehicles during his time in this academy. After having a series of low-level jobs, Matthew earned...
That's amazing. I didn't even know about that. But I just want to say, I sometimes listen to Dr. Grande, Todd Grande. He is a doctor. He's got a doctorate in psychology, but he does not necessarily practice psychology. I do not always agree with him, and there are times his reactions and opinions on things really shocks me, and there are other times that he really disgusts me as like a normie. And for anyone who doesn't know what a normie is, a normie, my definition, I guess, of a normie is anyone who just sort of trusts anything mainstream media, big pharma, big science, basically anything that corporations have purchased or bought into or are invested in, and therefore you can't really trust it because all of their conclusions are money-based, or everything they want is geared toward protecting the corporation. It's not necessarily geared toward protecting the betterment of the people, betterment of society. You know, like institutions and shit today, like in academia, how so much of academia is actually purchased by corporations, and it's for the betterment of the corporations, not necessarily the betterment of the planet or the people, you know. So basically anything mainstream, anything big pharma, big science, because big just means it was purchased by a corporation, and everything is for the sustainability of that corporation, not necessarily the sustainability of people or the planet. But not to get overly political here, I'm just saying Todd Grande is a normie. He absolutely is. And he's not a practicing psychologist, but he calls himself a doctor, and he often says, I'm not diagnosing anybody. I'm just providing an opinion of what could be happening. But it's like he can't really diagnose anybody anyway, because he's not a clinical psychologist. So I'm just saying his channel is a bit misleading, and people who follow him think he's a practicing psychologist. They don't really look into him. But anyway, I found his take on this case, on the Sandra Birchmore case, interesting. I found it compelling, and he provides details that I'm not sure other people know about yet or have read about yet. There's a whole lot of documentation to go through, and he seems to have gone through a lot of it quickly.
His high school equivalency diploma in 2004. This same year, he joined the Army and was trained as an explosives expert. In 2008, Matthew became an officer in the Wellesley Police Department. In 2012, he was hired by the Staunton Police Department. He became an instructor for the Police Explorers. Again, he had participated in this program when he was a teenager. In March 2010, a girl named Sandra Marie Birchmore joined the Police Explorers Academy. Matthew was her instructor. Sandra had been born on May 13, 1997, so she was 12 years old. She remained in this program until 2016, when both her mother and her grandmother died. She lived with an aunt for a few years. In October 2020, Sandra started working for a school in nearby Sharon. In December 2020, she moved into an apartment in Canton, Massachusetts. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On February 4, 2021, one of Sandra's coworkers called the police because Sandra failed to show up to work. This led to a welfare check at Sandra's apartment. When the police arrived at 11:46 a.m., they found Sandra's body in a bedroom. She was seated on the floor with a duffel bag strap tied around her neck. The strap was connected to a closet doorknob. It was clear that Sandra had been dead for a few days. In May 2021, the medical examiner determined that Sandra was the one who caused her death. This determination did not prevent the police from investigating further. Here is what they found during the course of their investigation. On October 28, 2012, Matthew sent Sandra a friend request on Facebook. Again, at this time, Matthew was an instructor in the Police Explorers program, and Sandra was a participant. In April 2013, Matthew and Sandra started having a sexual relationship. Matthew was 27, Sandra was 15. In Massachusetts, the age of consent is 16. Matthew and Sandra continued having sex all the way until her death. On multiple occasions in 2020 and in 2021, Matthew engaged in sexual activity with Sandra even though he was on duty as a police officer. On October 5, 2020, an individual, referred to as Person 1 in court documents, told Sandra that Matthew's wife was pregnant with the couple's third child. The baby was due in February 2021. Sandra was not happy about this situation. She told Matthew that he needed to have unprotected sex with her so that she could conceive a child. In exchange, Sandra would not tell anybody about his crimes.
So for anyone wondering where this is coming from the court documents, the documents that came out following the DOJ conference and the FBI conference. These things occurred. They are documented. And please keep in mind that Sandra Birchmore was a child when Matthew Farwell sent her that friend request on social media. Please remember that Matthew Farwell connected with Sandra Birchmore on social media inappropriately. He should have never done that. Because we all know, like, what happens after that when adults do it, when adults connect on social media. Adults who are attracted to each other when they connect on social media. What happens? They often message each other privately. And I'm just saying, like, that's extremely inappropriate for an instructor to send his student a friend request on social media. It's inappropriate. And an underage student, a child. So I am saying there were years and years of mental conditioning there. Him constantly communicating with her. She constantly communicating with him. In my opinion, Matthew Farwell conditioned Sandra Birchmore to depend on him, to associate joy with him, with Matthew Farwell, at a very young age. Again, this is what grooming is. It's what grooming is. It's getting into the victim's head and making the victim think that it's a good thing, it's a positive relationship, when in fact, the relationship is actually extremely harmful to the victim because the victim is not able to mentally consent to the relationship. Sandra Birchmore was never actually able to consent to her relationship, to her forced situation with Matthew Farwell. He conditioned her from an age way too young. She did not know what she was doing. And through Stockholm Syndrome, she probably never knew what she was doing.
He was well aware that their activity before the age of 16 represented a crime. Sandra also recognized that Matthew having sex with her while on duty was illegal. Matthew agreed to Sandra's terms, although they each had a different understanding about how much sex would occur. Sandra thought the sex would be more frequent than Matthew did. On December 28, 2020, Sandra sent a message to Matthew informing him that she was pregnant. She also sent him a photograph of a poster that...
And I don't like how Todd Grande focuses in on that detail, that Sandra thought it would be more frequent than Matthew did. And again, if we think of the psychology behind that Sandra wasn't actually able to consent to it, not mentally. Even if the age in Massachusetts, even if the legal age of consent in Massachusetts is 16, does anybody really know what they're doing when they're 16? No, not really. I think it's ridiculous that the age in Massachusetts is 16. People don't even really know what they're doing when they're 21. You know, I'm just saying, like, human beings are pretty stupid, and at least until 25, maybe 30 years old. I mean, that's when a majority of people really start maturing, you know, like, cause when we're 18 and 20, we're at our best physically. We're the best. We are the best we're ever going to look. And that tends to encourage us. It tends to embolden us to do things we wouldn't do in our 50s and 60s. Just, you know, so that on top of all the hormones and things that don't really make sense to us, relationships, you know, physical attraction, all of that gets factored in. And I'm just saying, we as humans tend to be extremely foolish in our teens, in our early 20s, some of us even in 30s and 40s. But for the most part, it's safe to say that by age 30, people tend to know more about themselves and more about what they want compared to when they were 15, 16, 20, 21. Okay? So I'm just saying, if for Matthew Farwell to have gotten into Sandra's head, mentally, psychologically, to have groomed her from a very young age, and then for her to maybe consider that the relationship was a reward system for her, for her to interpret the sexual activity with Matthew Farwell as some kind of reward system, some kind of like, if I do this, then he will be happy with me. And remember, she lost her mother at a very young age. She lost her grandmother. You know, did she have a structure? Did she have a resource system? Did she have a support system? It doesn't sound like she did. It sounds like she had to get on her own feet sooner than maybe a lot of kids her age. You know, a lot of kids her age are still getting a lot of help from their parents. When Sandra Birchmore died, 23 years old, you know, a lot of kids that age, and I call them kids even though they're legally adults, that's still a kid to me. And a lot of kids around that age are still relying on their parents. They're still getting help and support from their parents. Sandra Birchmore didn't have her parents. Okay, so I'm just saying, try to factor all of this in. She didn't have a support system. You know, and it's just like that Runkle of the Bailey video. You know, it's the kind of pond that abusers love to swim in. They love people who are vulnerable like Sandra, people who don't have a support system, people who don't have a lot of resources, people who have to grow up fast, you know, like, and he knew she didn't have anyone, Matthew Farwell. That's how he was able to get in. That's how Sandra Birchmore was able to be victimized. So again, I wish Todd Grande wouldn't just spit out points like that and really paint Sandra in a dark light that she doesn't deserve. It wasn't just that, Todd Grande. There was a lot more to it. Please provide some context. You know, it's just kind of slimy to me.
She made, indicating they were going to be parents. Matthew responded by writing, quote, I literally have nothing to say right now. How could you express that in text when I said I don't appreciate it, unquote. Throughout their relationship, Matthew had made it clear that certain topics should not be discussed in text messages. The couple continued to exchange text messages about the pregnancy. Matthew wrote, okay, well, we need to talk then. Sandra responded, no blank, that's obvious. Later in the exchange, Matthew wrote, I am mad, you act like you gave anyone a choice. Sandra responded, so you didn't have a choice? Matthew suggested that, as usual, she was doing whatever she wanted. At this point, Sandra wrote, quote, all I did was say, can I have it? You said, have what? And I said, you know what I'm asking you for, and stood up and said, yeah. You've been doing that. You mad? She's due in February, and I am in September, and you don't know how you're gonna be there for both of us. And you need to be there during labor for me too, because your kid should matter, unquote. Matthew responded, you are truly the worst person on the face of the earth. After Sandra threatened to expose the truth about
I mean, for the attention to be on that particular segment in their communication, again, I think more context needs to be provided here. And I haven't watched this video, not to the end, and I hope he provides context. But again, it's like, why is Dr. Todd Grande segmenting the communication like this?
Matthew's criminal behaviors. Matthew responded, quote, you honestly have absolutely no idea how to treat people. I have blanking bent over backwards for you. Now you want to act like this was some free will decision. You have threatened me from the word go. If I didn't do and give you what you wanted, you would ruin me. I made a deal with you, and you changed the terms at every turn, unquote. On December 29, 2020, Matthew and Sandra met in person and talked. After the meeting, Sandra sent a text message to Matthew referring to physical violence. She indicated that she was uncomfortable, stressed out, and scared because she thought he was going to hit her. Sandra told an individual, referred to in court documents as person 2, that Matthew told her he wished she would just die and he wanted nothing to do with the baby.
What I'm also picking up on from, even though I disagree with how Todd Grande is segmenting their communication, what I am picking up on, the big picture, is that Sandra Birchmore psychologically wanted to mean more to Matthew Farwell. He had conditioned her so much and so effectively that he actually got her to want more from him and to want promises from him. It just, it's almost like that love potion situation where, someone really wants someone else and they give them the potion, but it backfires. And it's almost like Matthew Farwell had conditioned Sandra Birchmore into the reward system with him, the psychological abuse system with him, and physical abuse system with him, that Sandra Birchmore actually was conditioned into wanting more from him. It became a toxic, dangerous relationship between the two of them. And I don't even like calling it a relationship, because a relationship is with two consenting people. And in my opinion, Sandra Birchmore never actually had an opportunity to consent to her relationship with Matthew Farwell, even as she was 22 and 23 and pregnant with his child. I don't think Sandra Birchmore actually had any conscious choice in that entire situation. It was not a relationship. To me, she had likely been so psychologically and physically conditioned and abused that she probably didn't even really know what she wanted. But she had been so conditioned by the reward system with Matthew Farwell for that many years, for 7 or 8 years. A long time. And again, from a very young age, that for that long that she didn't know anything else. And the idea that Matthew Farwell's wife was pregnant with another baby was probably like triggering to Sandra, was probably threatening to Sandra, that her whole purpose in life at that point is to please Matthew Farwell. That's all she has known up until that point. Again, this is what I'm picking up on, big picture. I do not see Matthew Farwell as the victim Matthew Farwell thinks he is in these correspondences.
He put Sandra in a headlock and grabbed a cell phone from her hand. 10 days before her death, Sandra told an individual, referred to as person 3, that Matthew had pushed her to the ground after she showed him a fetal sonogram. Person 3 advised Sandra to leave Matthew, but Sandra said Matthew had been a big part of her life for several years. In early January 2021, Sandra communicated with Matthew about what their future with a child would look like. She indicated that she would not complain about holidays, but, quote, "I would like you to come a few days before Christmas and Easter so you can see what they get from me. I don't want you to leave them out," unquote. On January 20, 2021, person 2 called the Stoughton Police Department and mentioned the sexual relationship between Matthew and Sandra. Matthew was pretty upset about this. He sent a message to Sandra which read, "Dude, your blanking friend called my job." Later he indicated that Sandra had no idea how bad this was and wrote, quote, "I literally can't believe this is even real life. Like, what else do I have to worry about now?" which other friend will do something tomorrow, unquote. 3 days later, on January 23, Matthew asked Sandra for a key to her apartment. On the next day, January 24, she told him that she had his key. Sandra also gave Matthew the passcode to the apartment building's front door. Sandra communicated with a friend referred to as Person 9 that same day, writing, quote, "He'll be around as long as I keep a secret and don't tell anybody," unquote. She also mentioned how she had the upper hand in the situation, but she did not want to be that kind of person. Sandra mentioned that Matthew had examined her closet and bathroom, which she thought was weird. On February 1, 2021, a snowstorm hit the area, therefore schools shut down. Sandra was sent home from work early. On surveillance video, she could be seen arriving at her apartment building and getting in the elevator. Once in her apartment, Sandra sent messages to Matthew indicating that she wanted him to buy clothing the child could wear home from the hospital. At 5:01 p.m., Sandra went to the apartment building lobby and accepted the delivery of a DoorDash order. At 5:33 p.m., Sandra could be seen stepping outside the apartment building to retrieve a snow brush before returning. This is the last time she would ever be seen alive. At 9:14 p.m., Matthew was captured on video entering Sandra's apartment building. He was wearing a face mask and had a hood pulled over his head. At 9:43 p.m., Matthew left the apartment building. The police believe that Matthew murdered Sandra during that final visit to her apartment, but staged the scene to look like Sandra was responsible. Matthew resigned from the police department on April 1, 2022, and became a truck driver. On August 27, 2024, he was arrested and charged with murder. Now moving to my analysis. Matthew may have committed a number of serious crimes involving Sandra, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he killed her. Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that Matthew was guilty of murder. Starting with the inculpatory factors. Matthew violated the law when he had sex with Sandra in April 2013. Later, when she was over the age of consent, Matthew broke the law by having sex on duty. Sandra was aware that she could use these crimes to blackmail Matthew. This is exactly what she did after becoming upset, and she ultimately became pregnant with Matthew's child. Sandra reframed her blackmail effort as if it was no big deal, and Matthew accused her of changing the terms of their arrangement. Based on statements Sandra made to other people, Matthew was physically violent toward her, and he wished that she was dead. Matthew did not want to memorialize some of the communication in text form. Sandra repeatedly ignored these warnings. She was being casual about something that Matthew took very seriously. Matthew Farwell knew that he wouldn't fare well in prison. Despite promising to keep the secret, Sandra was telling her acquaintances about the relationship. From Matthew's perspective, he may have felt like Sandra was taunting him with her carelessness, constantly reminding him that she now had the power in the relationship. Matthew knew that he would get caught if this continued. From their communication, it's clear that Sandra and Matthew had different expectations about a future together. Sandra possessed an abundance of enthusiasm about her pregnancy, which was not shared by Matthew. She was interested in baby photographs, how to manage the holidays, and even having Matthew's name on the birth certificate. Not long before Sandra's death, Matthew examined her closet and bathroom. The closet doorknob was the same one involved in the fatality. 3 days before Sandra's body was discovered, Matthew visited her apartment for 29 minutes. He was wearing a face mask, but had previously resisted any mandates involving face masks, only using them when he was required to by work. Sandra's cell phone recorded movement just 3 minutes before Matthew left the apartment building. This was the last time her phone was active. The clothing Sandra was wearing was the same clothing from when she was last captured on video. 2 days after Sandra's body was found, Matthew was interviewed by the police. He admitted that he had been involved in a sexual relationship with Sandra, but falsely claimed the relationship did not start until 2020. There are many indications that Sandra was planning on remaining alive. In the days leading up to her death, She planned a gender reveal, a pregnancy announcement, and arranged to get baby photographs. Sandra had made arrangements for the care of her cats while in the hospital, but her cats were found in the apartment with her. Furthermore, there was evidence that Sandra died in the middle of cleaning laundry. The first medical examiner indicated that.
So I am grateful that Todd Grande seems to be providing details now, um, as to that it couldn't have been a suicide because Sandra was planning all of these things already for the birth of her child, that she was excited. She was excited to be a mother. And if she was planning for people to take care of her cats while, she was in the hospital with her baby, then she wouldn't have just like killed herself because her cats were there. Like, she would have wanted people to take care of her cats. I'm just saying, like, these are small details that may seem insignificant to some people, but to me it's pretty significant. And again, I do not always agree with Todd Grande. I'm kind of even regretting sharing this video because I don't want to give him I kind of don't want you guys to go over to his channel. If you want to follow him, it's your choice. Again, I listen to what he has to say sometimes, and sometimes I am enlightened. But a lot of the times, I'm just like, this dude just kind of sucks.
Sandra was responsible for her death. However, 2 other medical experts later determined that she was murdered. 3 days after being interviewed by the police, Matthew searched if messages could be recovered using the software that the police had access to. He then deleted the search from the phone. Moving to the exculpatory factors, no physical evidence connected Matthew to Sandra's death. No DNA, no fingerprints, nothing at all. In May 2020, less than a year before her death, Sandra was taken to a hospital after telling someone she wanted to harm herself. Sandra did not appear to be particularly stable as far as her mental health and did not make good decisions. For example, she was blackmailing a physically violent police officer. Clearly, she and Matthew had different expectations about the relationship. It is not out of the realm of possibility that Sandra did something drastic to herself. Maybe her final conversation with Matthew pushed her over the edge. When considering the evidence in this case, do I think that Matthew is guilty of murder? Yes, in my opinion, he is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. What do I think?
Thank goodness. Thank goodness. I don't know about you guys, but I wasn't sure where he was going there.
Happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Matthew was immature, self-centered, excitement-seeking, dominant, fearless, cold, callous, manipulative, deceptive, impulsive, irresponsible, had a sense of entitlement, and was exceedingly creepy.
I agree that I did get that from this whole ordeal as well. I picked up on Matthew Farwell's immaturity level. He just seems to be extremely immature. And I don't know who his wife is, but he seems extremely immature and extremely reckless.
When he first met Sandra, she was in a vulnerable position because she trusted police officers. By committing offenses against Sandra, Matthew affected the way she processed information and managed relationships. The mistreatment and the manipulation taught her that relationships were meant to be exploited. She learned to have a lack of empathy similar to the deficit observed in Matthew. Unable to see things from Matthew's perspective, Sandra started blackmailing him. To her, this made sense. This is how relationships worked.
That's excellent. I give Todd Grande some kudos here. Thank you for seeing that similarly as I have. That the way Sandra Birchmore treated Matthew Farwell toward the end of her life was symbolic. It was representative of how he had treated her, what his conditioning of her consisted of, what she had to adapt to. In a very sick way, if you think about it, Matthew Farwell sort of raised her while also having this extremely inappropriate psychopathic relationship with her, situation with her that I'm uncomfortable calling a relationship. But Brownie points to Todd Grande. Very few, but some.
Everybody took what they could. It was not about love. It was about leverage. Sandra recognized that Matthew could be dangerous, but she was in denial. Any fear that she did possess was overridden by her desire to have a life with a person who she believed cared about her. Now moving to my final thoughts. Matthew bears the blame in this situation. Sandra may have provoked him through blackmail, but Matthew's behavior set this catastrophe in motion. His continued relationship with her after the initial offenses reinforced and increased the amount of damage that was done, ensuring it was irreparable. Sandra never really had a chance to escape his grip. Through the police explorers, Sandra sought to join with the authorities, but was only offered an...
Again, thank you. She never had a chance to escape his grip. That's exactly my stance. Sandra Birchmore never actually had an opportunity to consent to the situation she had with Matthew Farwell. It was never given to her. She was too young to know what she was actually doing. And by the time she was old enough to know what she was doing, she still did not know what she was doing, because by that point, by the time she became an adult, she had been so conditioned, so psychologically manipulated, that it's like she didn't really know who she was. She was never given an opportunity to know who she was and to know what she wants, to know what is good for her. And that is entirely Matthew Farwell's fault here.
Unholy union. The love that she craved was transformed into the chains that bound her. She thought she could turn the tables on her oppressor, only to find out the depth of his depravity. The case again...
Right. She thought that her captor, her oppressor, if she could, because he had objectified her, she thought she could, in turn, itemize him. It became transactional for her, even though, like, he was the only example of, quote, love for her, which we know was not love. She still wanted something from him. He was the only idea of family to her at that time. You can tell by how she was sort of forcing her way through this pregnancy, against his consent, against his wishes. She wanted this pregnancy with or without him. And she made it clear to him that she was going to hold him to it. She was going to make him be responsible for this child. And she was going to make sure that he was involved with this child during the holidays. Like, she was planning all of this. And to me, she felt entitled to it. She felt like Matthew Farwell owed her this. And I mean, I'm saying Matthew Farwell owes her a lot. He owes her a lot more than this. But to her, like, what she wanted most of all was a family. And she wanted it with him. And again, it's not actually because she knew what she wanted. Her situation, her toxic cycle with Matthew Farwell was all she knew. It's an extremely tragic story. Like, she never really had a chance to live. And then he killed her. He used her, abused her, and then he killed her.
Matthew is documented not only in ink, but in the tears of a woman who never truly learned what it meant to be free. Those are my thoughts on the case of Matthew Farwell and Sandra Birchmore.
Thank you. That's exactly what I was saying before I knew where he was going, and I'm grateful. Again, I probably won't recommend this channel. I will leave the link in the description, below if you're interested. I can't stand behind everything. I can't stand behind his content, not through and through. But sometimes he surprises me, and this is one of those videos. He surprised me, and I'm grateful that as much as I disagree with Todd Grande on many other things, I agree with him on this one. But man, does he really start his videos in a controversial way. It's almost like on purpose. Thank you for watching.